Today we're going to paint a Space Marine. Hi guys, Jonathan from Two Raven Studios. If you're new here, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. Please subscribe. We have new videos every week and you don't want to miss out. So it's been a little while since I painted an action figure, so today, since the new McFarlane Space Marine has come out, we're going to paint one of those. So I didn't actually use one of the unpainted ones. I actually used the one that's painted up as a Space Marine. It's not that big a deal. It's not really painted blue. It's just blue plastic it's cast in. And I wanted to use this one because it has the chain sword, and since I'm painted up as a space shark, I wanted to have the chain sword as the weapon. So before you get started painting, we need to prep the model a little bit. So just like anything, there's mold lines on it that we want to clean off. So I disassembled the model. I pulled it apart at most of the joints. I just kind of used a little bit of pressure and, pulled apart the joints. I separated the arms from the body, the legs from the body, took the head off, and I also separated the torso into the different pieces. I wanted to remove the feet from the legs, but it was taking too much pressure that it wasn't coming off, so I didn't bother. I didn't want to break anything, so I just left the feet on. Once it's disassembled, again, like I said, we have to clean up those mold lines. So what I used was emery board, sanding sticks, and just a little bit of sandpaper. And I went over most of the model with it, just so the primer would have something to stick to a little bit better. Once that was done, I primed it. And what I used was this Rust-Oleum granite. So just went over the whole model with this. I want to replicate my scheme that I use on my normal size space sharks. So I'm going to link up here a video of how I do that, so you kind of get an idea what we're working for. Now that all the pieces are primed, though, we're going to go in with the airbrush and add a little bit of shading and cover up anything we missed with the rattle can. So let's get right into that. So I'm starting with Vallejo German Panzer Gray primer, and I'm adding shadows in, as well as covering up any parts the initial primer from the spray can might have missed. So this is just a dark gray. We're being a little bit subtle with it, and just covering all the shadows up and any parts that were missed by the initial primer coat. So next up, I want to create some stencils for the exile markings, and I just sketched something out in a piece of masking tape, and now I'm just cutting it out with an X-Acto knife. So you can kind of see I had a couple drafts before I found something I was happy with, but we're just going to use this to mask off so we can spray some exile markings onto the armor. And now that we finished it, we masked the areas off, and I'm spraying with THRALL flesh. It's just a light bone color. Again, these exile markings are the tribal type markings that the Carcharodons have on their armor. Just a nice light coat of this THRALL flesh. Then I'm just going to highlight by adding some white ink into the last paint and just creating a little bit brighter areas. This is going to help it look a little bit weathered by having the two tones. I also did the same thing on the shoulder pads. This time I actually have a Cricut Maker machine, and I used that to cut out this design. You could do the same thing by hand if you wanted to, but this is just the chapter logo on the shoulder pad. You can kind of see a couple pieces of tape where the edges are sticking into it. That's just kind of to look like the paint wore off in certain areas. And once that's done, I'm going to go back in with just black paint and paint in the eye of the shark and the gills and clean up anything that needs to be cleaned up. We're just painting the eye and going over the gills. Unlike the rest of the armor, the shoulder pads are black, so I just sprayed this black instead of the gray in the initial step. And the last way we're going to do this is we are just using that same mix I used to the airbrush and painting on with a brush some of the more detailed designs. So just on this little tilting plate here on his shoulder pad, I'm just putting in some tribal designs by hand in the brush. So by using a combination of stencils and the airbrush and brushing by hand, you can kind of get a lot of different type of tribal designs all over the armor. So next up, what I'm going to do with black primer through the airbrush, I'm just brushing in all the joints between it. You could do this with a brush if you don't feel comfortable. I actually went in with a brush to clean up the edges a little bit, but just for speed, I'm going in with the airbrush and painting in all the joints of the armor. If you're really worried, you can mask off, or like I said, do this with a brush. And I'm putting a stripe down the middle of this guy's helmet and showing you how I did that. So first I laid down a strip of masking tape where I wanted the stripe to be, so I have a nice straight line, and then put other pieces down both sides. Since I have that nice straight line of the tape in the middle, I know that my finish line is going to be nice and straight as well. And you can kind of see I did the same thing I did on the shark, where I put little pieces of tape so it looks like the paint wore off in certain spots. Now I'm just going in with Amethyst Rose and spraying in the red stripe down the center of the helmet. I put red stripes down the center of all my sergeant's helmets, and this guy is a sergeant, so he gets the red stripe. And then I'm mixing a little bit of purple ink in with the last paint just to add some shading into the stripe on the helmet. Once this is done, you can pull off the masking tape. And next thing I'm going to do is with some bootstrap leather. You can use any medium brown. I'm just basing in the belt and the pouches on the back. You can kind of see the primer I used was a little bit, have a satin finish, so the paint's speeding up a little bit, but it's no big deal. Just give it a couple coats and you'll get some good coverage here. Once this is done, we're going to move to put the figure back together. With all the base coats done, now I'm going to reassemble the model. The reason I'm doing this now is I rightly assumed that I was going to mess up the paint a little bit putting it back together, and I want to be able to fix it now before we get further in the process. So once you have all the base coats done, stick it back together. I also want to put the weapons in the hand for the same reason. With the weapons, I did a few tricks to make it easier for myself. The bolt pistol was just cast in a gray plastic, so what I did was, rather than airbrushing or spraying it, with a regular brush, I brushed on some black primer onto the bolt casing and left the rest of it that metal color. So now there's no paint to be scratched off there. And when I was putting the weapons in the hands, what I did was hit them with a heat gun so I could stretch the hand open a little bit, put the weapon in, and then stretch it back shut. That way I wasn't kind of forcing it in and scratching paint off in the process. So get the figure back together, and we're going to start the weathering process. Now that we have it assembled, what I'm going to do is I have Sigor Brown, Gorgrunta Fur, and Snakebite Leather contrast, and I'm just randomly putting patches all over the leather belt and pouch, just to kind of give it like a mottled, worn leather look. So I'm not trying to be neat here, I'm actually trying to make it look a little bit blotchy, so it simulates the leather texture on this. I also painted the chest emblem. It was based with Decayed metal by scale 75, and now I'm going in with Moonstone Alchemy, and I'm kind of edge highlighting, but my main goal here is actually to add scratches and weather marks into it. So I'm trying to make this look worn. The end result is I'm getting a bit of an edge highlight, but what I'm doing is adding weathering more so than the edge highlight. Now I'm going to add some variation to the armor, so I'm using Skeleton Horde contrast paint through the airbrush and just brushing on. This is going to be subtle and just give us a little bit of color variation on those big surfaces, making them look a little bit dirty. So you can just go over all of the gray armor with this color, just adding in a little bit of detail as well as the white parts. You can kind of see I'm also going over the exile markings. Then I'm just going to repeat that process with Wildwood. This is a much darker color, so you want to be a little bit lighter touch here and be a little bit more subtle because you could overdo this very easily. But again, we're making it look dirty and adding some variation in the color of the large plates. So this is kind of step one of our weathering, is these contrast paints through the airbrush. Now on to step two of the weathering. We're using oil paints because I love oil paint. So this is just black thinned down with mineral spirits as I headbutt the camera, and just shading in all of the armor parts as well as the leather. We'll be getting this black color. We're just trying to add detail into the shadows as the camera wants to focus on my hand instead of the figure. Next up, we have a mix of ivory black and burnt sienna oil paints, and I'm going into the armor, so you can kind of see I'm putting it in the cracks and then wiping it with a Q-tip. The Q-tip is just dry, and any kind of overspray, I'm actually just blending into the surface, and again, adding just a little bit more color variation in there. So as you move around, you can kind of see what I'm doing. This figure is so big, it's kind of hard to get the camera to focus on it. It keeps focusing on my hand. I'm sorry about that. The white parts of the face are also going to get the same mix. Kind of see I'm going in the grill of the face there as well. And lastly, I have pure burnt sienna oil paint now. Again, this is all thinned down with mineral spirits, and I'm going over all the black parts here. We're just trying to make this look like a little bit of rust or dirt on the black part. Since we can't shade the black parts further down, we're just going to use this lighter color on it. Next up, I'm going to add in some chips and scratches with a sponge, and it's that middle mix of the black and burnt sienna oil paint. The reason I'm doing this with oil paint is if there's anything I don't like, I can very easily clean it off. But you could just as easily do this with acrylic paint. Like I said, I'm just using the oil paint here because if there's something I don't like, I can quickly clean it off. There's just a little tiny bit of mineral spirits mixed in here to make it dry faster, but it's a pretty solid paint now for this technique. And then you can go back in with the brush and kind of reinforce what you did with the same mix. You can kind of see I'm going along the edges here, the sharp edge of that backpack, and just reinforcing what I did with the sponge. And after this, you're going to want this to dry for a little bit before you move on. The next step, I'm going in with Bootstrap leather, which is the color we base coated the leather parts, and just add some chips and scratches to the edges. This is acting as a highlight, but again, it's weathering. So we're using the weathering as highlights on this figure. And then I'm just going to repeat that, further refining it with some Beast Hide, which is a lighter tan color. You don't have to use the exact paints I'm using, it's just the concepts are what's important. So just little dots along the edge, some scratches to make the leather look nice, old, and worn. And I'm going to go back in with the Moonstone Alchemy and just bring some bright spots back into the chest piece. So what I already did before, we're just repeating that step, the scratches in there. And then we're going to do the same thing on the weapons with Thrash Metal. So this is actually the pure plastic underneath, and I'm just adding some scratches and edge highlights with this color to bring out the detail and make it look worn. Next up, we're going to do the eyes. So I'm going to start with a teal color at the very bottom. The lenses in the Carcharodons are pure black, but I want to give them something a little bit more than just being black, so we're going to start with this teal color here. This will be the sharp reflection at the bottom when we're done. Next up, I'm going to use turquoise, and the same process on the eye lenses are done here, but I'm using the teal and the turquoise, kind of blending the two back into each other to create a nice transition. It's just easier to see on this larger pad on the side. And then once that's done, I go in with black Templar contrast paint and kind of dot in to make it look more black and darkened eye. And I give it that black lens look. After you do this, you can add a dot of white of reflection in the eye if you want to. Now we're going to weather and highlight all of the lighter colored parts. I'm using Sickly Skin, which is an off-white. You could use white here too, but you can see I'm just dotting along the edges, creating some highlights there. I'm also going to highlight a little bit on the exile markings as well, just to bring some parts of those designs out as well. You just want to do weathering just to make the edges pop. And then with CRYX Bane Highlight, which is a medium gray, I'm going to underline and outline the edges of the plate. So the edges of the plates are going to get outlined, and I'm also underlining some of the bigger chips that I put in with the oil paint earlier. You can kind of see I'm drawing little lines underneath those chips to make them look like deeper scratches. The other thing you can do with this color is sponge some of it on the way we sponged on the other paint earlier, and again, just adding more and more weathering. Trying to make this look as beat up as we can. And last step here, we're just going to go in with Graveyard Denim and do the same thing on all the black parts. So we just want to make them look a little bit beat up and worn by adding some broken edge highlights and some scratches into them. And after this, we're going to move to a third and final step of weathering with the airbrush again. So I got these liquid pigments from Green Stuff World, and I haven't tried them before, so we're going to try them out in this figure. I actually was really happy with how they turned out. So I'm starting out with Dark Rust. I'm focusing this more on the bottom of the feet and some little spots here and there in the black areas just to give it some variation of color. But I really like how this applies. It applies nice and smooth through the airbrush, but it gives you that chalky finish of powdered pigments. I'm just going to further refine that a little bit with some medium rust. So this color's a little bit lighter than the last one. Again, focusing mainly on the feet, but we're going to put a little bit up on the shoulder pads and the other areas just to add some color variation. We don't want to overdo this, just nice and light, maybe a little bit here on the weapon. Just wherever you feel like the panel needs to be broken up a little bit more. And one final step of this, now we're going to go in with light rust and repeat the process once again. Again, we're just going over a lot of the darker areas, that variation of color, if the camera will stop focusing on the airbrush. And then I'm going to use verdigris on the metal parts. So we're just going to add a little bit of weathering into the metal with this. So again, less is kind of more here. Just want a little bit of variation and weathering in it. We've already done a lot. We don't need to overdo this step. You can kind of see this step when I do the tilt of the weapon. I really like how that came out. So that little blast just makes it look nice and weathered. And I'm not a huge fan of a lot of gore on models, but I used a little Flesh Tearers red here to kind of make some caked on dried blood on the teeth of the chainsword. Again, I'm going very subtle with this. I'm not a huge fan of kind of blood effects, but I just want to give it a little bit something here. I'm using the Flesh Tearers red contrast through the airbrush. And once you're done this, the model should be finished. So this was a lot of fun working on it. Barely fits in my photo box here. But you can kind of see all the variations of colors we added in through the weathering and all the chipping effects. You don't have to go over the top with the color gradients like you do on smaller miniatures because the figure is so big it casts its own shadows, but we were just trying to add a lot of interest via the weathering on this one. I hope you guys found that useful. If you did, please leave a like. Did you pick up one of these figures? If you did, let me know how you're going to paint it in the comments below. I really enjoyed painting this action figure, and I want to do more action figures in the future. Let me know if that's something you guys would be interested in as well. I'm going to leave some links to some of my miniature space sharks that I painted so you get an idea of how I do it on the smaller scale. Until next time, go on gaming and paint your minis.